Welcome back, everyone, to another broadcast of In the Trenches. Today, I'm sitting down with my good friend, Robert Ordway, who is a senior policy advisor for a U.S. senator and an owner of the image consulting company Rusted Oak. He's an entrepreneur, a family man, a good dude. We've hung out together at Menfluential. It's been a few years since we've caught up. Time has really flown. I think the last time was 2020. So, Robert, thanks for being on In the Trenches.
Hey, Tom, thanks for having me on your podcast. And it kind of reminds me of some of the folks I've seen here in Washington, D.C., where you have that conversation where you're like, hey, I saw you 6 months ago. And they're like, no, it was 2019 before COVID. I feel like there was a bit of a black hole of a time warp. And, if you recall, Menfluential conference was literally 2 weeks before COVID became a national emergency. And so, we saw each other at kind of the last point of civilization until now.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, totally kind of trippy when you think about it, because that was the weekend when they were like shutting everything down. I'm like, well, I guess I got my last, flight out of this, my last event. So a good way to close it down. And that was for Antonio and for those guys, it was going to be their last event anyway, which is a bummer. I think they should bring it back now, but it kind of worked out perfectly.
Yeah, totally. And what was interesting for me is that I did come home and I did have the flu. That was March 1st when I spoke. Flew back from Atlanta. I was sick for 2 or 3 days, pretty, in bed, fever. And, I'll never know if that was actually COVID or not. But, my barbell coach, Matt Reynolds, Barbell Logic gives feedback within 24 hours of your workouts. And it was the first time Matt didn't respond or have someone cover. And, a couple of days later, he texts me, he's like, hey, dude, I'm in a hospital with COVID and double pneumonia. I'm like patient 0 for the state of Missouri. And it was wild, and so we went from, having such a great time to him being, hospitalized. Obviously, he's much better now, but it was just a wild kind of turn of events, if you will.
Yeah. And obviously, a lot of repercussions since then. I mean, I'll tell you what, at least personally, I was like, oh, you know what? This is actually great for me because I didn't really much anyway. I did events very rarely. Obviously, I would do it for Antonio and those guys, and I would speak at a handful of things. But really, since then, it really benefited me in many ways. As obnoxious as the whole thing was for a couple of years there, it was like everything's going online. Well, I'm already working online. So I was able to kind of just go with it. But it was this kind of strange time warp where now I'm like, oh, it's 2024, almost, I guess, going into 2025. But as of this recording, mid 2024, and it's felt like, there's like this, what happened the last few years. But I know for you I believe you were already in the U.S. Senate in 2020. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And you were running your business as well at the same time, right?
Right. Yeah. I moved to Washington, D.C. in January of 2017. I had a few different jobs and was called into the Senate for my home state of Indiana in January of 2019. I had wanted to go to what was called Men's Style Con since it was formed because I knew Brock McGough, the modest man, being a 5'7" guy, obviously knew of his website and we had interactions. And I wanted to go in like 2014, 15, 16, and just never made it happen. But once I moved to DC in 17, I'm like, you know what, I'm going. And so the first time I was a guest, but then quickly in 18 and 19, I sat on panels. And then the last one, I had my own solo presentation in 2020. And so, but I was in the Senate since 19. So a few of those conferences, I was kind of wearing 2 hats at once.
So yeah, let's go back in time and then we'll get caught up to what you're doing now on the entrepreneurial side of things, on the policy and like political side of things, which is super interesting. I don't think I've actually had anybody on the podcast before who's done that. So that'll be kind of interesting. I have some questions to ask and how that all works.
If we're going to talk about politics, you have to have whiskey, right?
That's right. But let's start at the beginning. Like go back in time. You were telling me a few things before we hit record about your family. So again, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, but I'd like to go back to when you were younger, kind of where you're from and what led you into some of the things that you're doing today. A little bit of that backstory.
Yeah, well, my family are, Southern migrants from Kentucky that came up to Gary, Indiana in the late 1950s. If you're familiar with the industry, I mean, the steel industry is, the home of it is Northwest Indiana now, but there were about 200 mills, 50, 60 years ago that have all been consolidated. And so my granddad migrated up and ultimately my dad worked in the steel mills. I was told that was not an option. And deindustrialization continues to this day. Essentially, I grew up in a very hard-scrabble, blue-collar community, a union family, and graduating high school in 2003 was unique. I think the challenge for me was, at the age of 13, my dad was diagnosed with ALS. That was 1998. And there were no assistive technologies for those people. You were Stephen Hawking, not really many therapy or kind of groups to talk through things with people who are living your experience. And then, no medical treatments. I think one was approved back in the 90s, but it really didn't do a whole lot to help those folks. So I felt like my dad was given a death sentence, and my sister was only 9 at the time. It was really challenging because my mother had bipolar disorder, and so there's a lot of challenges on the mental side there. And so, very fortunate for me, the war in Iraq started in '03. I had done really well on this test called the ASVAB because of my blue collar upbringing, electrical, mechanical, wood shop. It had a lot of unique components that I really enjoyed compared to other standardized tests like the SATs. Essentially, all 4 branches were calling me, trying to recruit me. I was what's called a DEP, a delayed entry program. So you can't sign a contract at 17, but you kind of can make a verbal commitment essentially. But all that changed when my mom went away to the war in Iraq in March of '03. A month later, I got something called the Eli Lilly Endowment Scholarship, which is a full ride to anywhere in the state of Indiana. The drug company was really concerned about the brain drain. And so in the late 90s, they started these scholarships in all 92 counties. By some happenstance, I received one of these scholarships that changed my life trajectory. I started life at Purdue. Dad passed away a few months later, ended up transferring up to Valparaiso University, which is about an hour from Chicago. And, the next big thing that happened was I switched from engineering to finance. And finance was a great degree to have from '03 to '07 while I was in college. Not a good degree when I graduated. So I finished in December '07, and the entire tail of the market just fell out, right? So I would have had a better career having a degree in underwater basket weaving than finance. And so essentially, through 2008, it was a bit of a struggle. I had moved to Chicago. I worked in the Chicago Board of Options Exchange, and ultimately found myself at the beginning of '09 in grad school back at Valpo studying basically public policy. And on my 3rd day, that's when my mother took her own life. And so from '09 to present, my life has consisted of running political campaigns, being a civil servant or a political appointee, also kind of working for entrepreneurs, being an entrepreneur. So I've kind of touched a lot of different worlds at once, but, my parents, kind of having that little tough upbringing, I think there's a silver lining in adversity, how it takes fire to temper the sword. And so, my goal is to help share with others how to build personal agency so that they can overcome challenges in life.
When did you, from that point, again in the finance world, kind of going through those things, like when did you go the entrepreneurial route, and how did you know that was the right thing to do?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. My mom wasn't always the most truthful person about my upbringing, and a few years after my dad passed away, I had all these essentially thoughts that he was not my biological father. Just certain things about my early childhood didn't make sense. I was kind of a vagabond between Virginia, Kentucky, and Indiana. Lived with my mom's sister. I lived with my dad's parents in Kentucky after they migrated back south after Papa retired from U.S. Steel. And, eventually I was able to get my family to kind of come clean about who my biological father was. And I ended up meeting him within months after. It's amazing with the internet. So between, December '07, when I graduated, in February '08 is the time that I learned about a biological father. But he was a 2-star rear admiral in the Navy. But more importantly, his father was a PhD in electrical engineering and launched the largest IPO up until Google. And he's deemed to be Dallas's most successful venture capitalist. He was pitching General Motors on electric vehicles in the early '90s, and people, were kind of poo-pooing it. So kind of a visionary. And so I think to some degree, the entrepreneurship component is in my blood. I think when you meet your biological predecessors, what you find out is that, both of them are engineers. I was going to be an engineer. We're all very good at math. moving from a poor community, East Gary, Lake Station, where I grew up in Northwest Indiana, I moved to Valparaiso for college, and I ended up living there off and on for about 14 years. It was founded in the 1850s by farmers, and the university, which actually it was called the Valparaiso Men's and Women's College. It was admitting women, gosh, 60 years before they had the right to vote. And it's founded by old German stock, and they're very, very entrepreneurial. So after my dad passed away, all the other men that kind of filled that void in college and beyond were all business owners, all very entrepreneurial. As I got involved in the political world, it was something that I desired, of trying to be the captain of your own ship, even if it's just a rowboat.
So yeah, man, wow. Okay, so you went through a lot at a pretty young age. I guess, how did you deal with all that? I mean, finding out. So, did you have suspicions? You like, what was your dad like, who raised you, and then finding your biological father? Like, what was that experience like? Do you still keep in touch with him? Like, what has that experience been like?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about being from, it's not, well, there are two things that are researched. Appalachians who move north. So that's where the phrase hillbilly comes from. And I think it's very, it was popularized and kind of stereotyped. And what they don't realize is that there were several millions of Southern whites from all of Kentucky and Tennessee and Alabama that moved all over the North for jobs. And they were deemed hillbillies just because they spoke with a Southern dialect and twang. The Black migration, Great Migration, is a little more studied because Blacks went to very few cities. So they went to, Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, and most importantly, where I'm from, Gary. Gary is the first city, along with Cleveland, to have a Black mayor, Richard Hatcher, in 1967. But having that Southern upbringing, it was a little bit odd growing up, where even though my dad was born in Gary, I would say, culturally identified as a Kentuckian, Western Kentuckian, a Flatlander. And so Southerners have something called a culture of honor. It's a little more masculine. It's a little more related to, your public facing image. And, as my dad always said, all a man has is his word, like your handshake is everything. And so growing up in the North, there were certain things that I agreed with some of my peers, and other things where it's like, why is my dad give me all these chores that my peers don't have? Why is he teaching me these things? And there's that kind of agrarian legacy that I have from the South, as my family were essentially, subsistence farmers for 150 years. And so that's kind of a fascinating component. Switching over to my biological side, as a kid, I never could understand why my parents, who had the same teachers as me, K through 12, were never as good at me as math, running, sports. There was something that just didn't kind of jive. When you get to seventh grade and your mom and dad can't help you with your homework, and then you're finding your homework to be very easy, it was like, it was just strange to me. But then when I met my biological father, who went to the Naval Academy, I was like, okay. And he was extremely good at math. And obviously my grandfather even more so. It starts to click in a sense that, okay, well, this whole running gene and math gene, there's something to it. And to finish your question, yeah, after I met my biological father and grandfather, both in 2008, maintained a great relationship and saw them about a month ago for my half-sister's wedding out in Napa Valley. And they're doing great. I think if I have any sort of qualms, it's that my biological father is about 6'1", 6'2", and I became 5'7". I feel like I got the truly short end of the stick.
I hear you. I I
And the
understand.
hair. And they both
Yeah,
have
right.
hairline. They both have great hairlines, so I'm not sure what the heck happened there either.
Yeah, it's like everybody I think on my mom's side is like over 6 foot. And I'm like, here I am, like 5'9". I'm like, come on, but it's all right. We make up for it, you know what I mean, in other ways. So, but like, so okay, so tell me this: you go through that experience, then your mom passes away. How does your rest of your family handle that? How'd you handle that?
Yeah, I think it's challenging. I mean, I think, you live life in forward, but you analyze in reverse. And, my mom was clearly one of the most attractive girls of her class, didn't have a lot of direction, joined the Navy, politely put on the product of an affair between a Navy officer and a enlisted person. Things happen. I think the word on the street is I was conceived in Iceland. I don't know, but essentially, I think mom had always battled the bipolar and the depression. I think is certainly has a strong genetic component in my family on the mom side. You've got 3 generations of suicides. I don't think that's truly just environmental. I think there's a nature component as well as nurture. And so, it seemed like over time, I would say the poles of her bipolar got farther and farther apart to where she alienated the entire family, ended up moving south. She ended up kind of retiring kind of all of a sudden from the Navy and from the school system and moved to Kentucky where her sister was and some of my cousins. And, even they will tell you she became a person where, one day she said she was going to kill herself. And 3 minutes later, someone shows up to her house and she's like, "Hey, what are you talking about? Everything's great. You want to eat some cookies I just baked?" And so, I truly believe that my aunt was diagnosed with bipolar, but also schizophrenia. And I still kind of wonder whether my mom was sort of schizophrenic because she really had these 2 sides that were so opposite. And towards the end, it became kind of clear that this was kind of going to happen. And I don't think it helped that we were in the Great Recession. And when my mom retired and moved to Kentucky, she moved to a place where there were no jobs. And I think the best thing she could find and she was an officer in the Navy, and the best thing she could find in retirement was like some $8 an hour job at like a gas station. I think there were some other jobs she had at Purdue Chicken and whatnot, but my mom was a very, very talented blue collar person when it came to electrical, mechanical. She could re-roof a house, do flooring. She could rebuild all kinds of stuff, but I'm not sure if it took me totally by surprise when she took her own life. But I will say the aftermath, I think we were in a society where you were kind of taught to just kind of maybe bottle things up. And I think, my sister, we have different genetics because we're only half siblings, because she's a product of my dad, not my father. I am not. So we've got some different genetic lineage, but at the same time, we were we had a front row seat to 2 different horror shows at once. And, I think both of us have taken a decade or 2 to totally work through that. But I don't think, if I had to, recommend anything, it's like you should probably see a therapist sooner rather than later. Also, I think you got to have some sort of belief in, a greater world power or global power or whatever, that, things truly happen for a reason. And what are the teaching moments at this? It's easy to look back and say that versus when 5 minutes after the event happens, how you internalize it. So,
would you say it kind of sounds like too your backstory a little bit? It's like, have you read the book Hillbilly Elegy?
Yeah, I've actually read it probably more than most people. It continues to get a lot of reviews. I think last time I checked, it had 85,000 reviews on Amazon. It's been reviewed more than even Rick Warren's Purpose Driven Life. That book has like 15,000 reviews. Once you hit 1,000 reviews on Amazon, you're typically kind of a New York Times bestseller. So if that's a metric for, how successful JD Vance is, who is now a, U.S. Senator for the state of Ohio, I resonated a lot with his story because I lived with my grandparents for a full year in Kentucky, but we both him and I are from parallel universes of steel cities that have been deindustrialized, but we both spent summers in Kentucky with our grandparents, even though he's truly Appalachian. My family are what they call flatlanders, Western Kentucky, very culturally different, but even the dialect and the slang and all that's different. But, again, the whole mamaw and papaw thing there are definitely some commonalities in this stuff. But, I think he wrote a book that really truly uncovered some of the challenges of Southern to Midwestern migration and deindustrialization, and what happens to families when things fall apart.
Tell me a little bit about your book. Like, are you writing something almost like in a similar vein, if you will, like kind of a look into your life, a memoir, but also a look into the culture of this area? Or tell me a little bit more about kind of what you're writing and why you're writing it.
Yeah, I think when I was running my clothing store, so my memoir started, I remember being an undergrad wanting to talk about ALS. because it was so obscure and so painful. I felt like a World War II veteran where you come home and you can't talk about it. And then maybe you commiserate at the VFW or the Legion. But at the end of the day, you probably become an alcoholic or you abuse your wife or your children because you didn't see the therapist, because that's not masculine, it's not manly, right? You just need to bottle it up, have a drink of whiskey, and move on. But the reality is, every time I wanted to write about the book, I would have nightmares every single time, like clockwork. And so the book, when I was living in Chicago looking for work, it was a presidential election cycle. I had read both the memoirs of Barack Obama and John McCain, who both were heavily influenced by the presence or absence of their fathers. And after meeting my biological father, I was like, well, this is now a new twist in my personal life and story. But also, you fast forward a couple of years when you have the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge that happened in 2014. And so, I hated it because it had kind of pulled a Band-Aid off a wound that had not healed. But at the same time, it gave a disease that was obscure and unfortunately seemed to be more present now than ever before. It gave it the funding and the exposure and the branding that it needed to help other people. So I kind of continued to want to write this book. Once I moved to when I had my men's clothing store in 2015 and 16, that summer of 2016, I was working 100 hours a week, pretty unhappy. I realized as a perfectionist that my parents had kind of unfortunately bred me to be. I was very unhappy. And I didn't read any books in 2016 because I was working 100 hours a week. And there were like all these people like, you got to read Hillbilly Elegy. You got to be this reminds me of you. And I bought the book off Amazon. I remember like sitting it on the shelf by some bottles of whiskey, because I would always have kind of just books kind of peppered throughout the store. And then finally one day you're like, you know what, like screw this place. I'm going to go read this book. And then I read it. I think it was like in 1 or 2 sittings, and I just really enjoyed it. But I noticed that we definitely had some very huge differences. Is that, J.D. Vance's history, he's from a community that's still predominantly more white. It didn't deindustrialize that much compared to where I'm from, Gary and the surrounding communities. Gary is second only to, I believe, Detroit, lost 2/3 of its population over a few decades. And, I believe that I grew up with a lot more minorities through Southern migration, blacks, browns, mostly Mexican, some Puerto Rican. But then Northwest Indiana has this history at the turn of the 20th century of Eastern and Central European migration. So I grew up with people who, maybe some people identify as white, but Greeks, Slavs, Polish, Croatian, Serbian, Lithuanian. I mean, Gary had 50 plus ethnicities between 1906, when Gary Works was founded, in 1921, 15 years. I mean, that's wild. All these men who came to America for political exile, religious exile, job opportunities, unions don't exist. And these people are trying to coexist in a steel mill. It's a wild, wild, history. And then, pre-union, you've got Southern whites and Southern blacks that were recruited by the mills. And then you have one of the mills went to Mexico. And so East Chicago is mostly Mexican for that reason. And so you've got this kind of melting pot. And maybe it's more of a tossed salad in the sense that maybe people didn't mix as well.
Yeah.
And so, you've got anti-immigration bills that become law in the early 1920s. And so, the steel mills have to go south and get even more people. And they kind of prey on their lack of education. Like they're looking for a better life. But at the same time, the corporations, they're trying to create racial and ethnic divisions, because if they do that, then they won't unionize against J.P. Morgan and the man, at the time. But remember, the EPA doesn't exist. The cancer rates and the coke furnaces, blast furnaces are 10x anything in this country. And so I think my background and understanding, and I actually worked as a contractor in the steel mills off and on from 2003 when I was in high school. I got to leave high school to go work for an engineering firm and spent time in the mills, did a lot of detail design, drafting, all the way up until 2015 when I had my clothing store. And so I was a little bit of a freelancer, doing civil, electrical, mechanical engineering. And so I always like to say my book is, it's titled Millrat. The subtitle is more about ALS, adversity, and the American dream. And I think where JD Vance and I are similar is we've got this kind of agrarian culture of honor turned Midwestern Rust Belt. We're 6 months apart in age. Where we're different is that, he had all these revolving door, fake fathers, masculine figures. I believe that even though my dad had ALS most of my childhood, I think I had one of the best dads on planet Earth, even though we were non-religious, didn't have money. I just think that there's ethics and values and culture that my dad bestowed upon me that supersede all the other privileges of the world. And so I always tell people the short story is my book is Hillbilly Elegy meets Tuesdays with Morrie. And then the longer statement is essentially how faith, family, and community are essential to helping individuals build the personal agency they need in order to overcome adversity and deal with failure in their pursuit of the American dream.
Super interesting. Yeah, I think, and I forget when I read that, obviously, probably when it came out, give or take. I think it was pretty popular at the time. It was just kind of an interesting look at, again, a culture that is not talked about a lot. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. Like, I think I obviously I don't relate terribly to Appalachia, but like certain things I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I knew people from there and knew guys and stuff like that.
Well, it's unusual for a book during a presidential cycle to get a lot of traction. And I think his book came out in June of 16. And obviously, Senator Vance had a lot of connections, but the book became kind of a explainer of, President Trump's populism. Like, why are all these union guy white males in the Midwest who are, again, my family, I would say, are fairly lifelong blue dog Democrats from Western Kentucky. Western Kentucky was 80% Democrat for 200 years up until George Bush. And then it slowly flipped, and now it's 80-20 Republican. And so a lot of it has to do with, the erosion of local TV, newspapers, radio, and all, once we get to the internet age, 2004 is probably a good benchmark after I graduated high school, where, Facebook was born in 2004, right? And Barack Obama was the first kind of Facebook elected president. He had young millennials that understood the technology, but the reality is the profit model really became about the Google algorithm. And as we've gone farther and farther into this space, all the profit in communications now resonates with Washington, D.C., and the clicks and all that. And so what we've done is we've nationalized local issues. And so for Kentuckians like my family, if you think about Western Kentucky, you got coal, you have coal over there. It's very different than Eastern Kentucky, but you've got coal, tobacco, and you got a fairly Baptist religious population. Well, the National Democratic Party, whether it's real or perceived, have attacked those things, right? And so those people feel like the Democratic Party had alienated them. And that's how they moved into the Bush camp by 2004. And now we're squarely in the Trump camp. And I think in Western Kentucky, there are very few at city, county, state elected officials that are Democrat. And it's all happened within literally the last 20 years.
Yeah, man, it's super fascinating. I think probably don't have time to get into it, but I feel like you're in the space a little bit. Granted, I know you do a lot of the financial policy stuff, but like I do feel like in politics and stuff like that, obviously, I think a lot of this is just, a lot of these things are engineered, they're purposefully engineered, and to create division, to just control and manipulate. So, and not that I need to go into it too deeply, but I think it's fascinating. So let me step back. I want to find out, how did you actually get into that in the first place? Because I know people are like, oh, maybe when I'm a kid, like, oh, I'll be president someday. And then you get older and you're like, oh, no, I won't. How do you get into that as an adult?
Define that.
Get into the Senate, get into politics. Like, what was that path like?
Yeah, well, I think, I remember voting when I turned 18. It was a municipal year. And my dad's like, you need to pull a Democratic ballot so you can vote for this gal named, the current mayor, Shirley Wadding. She was the only 3-term elected person in our community. And I think what my dad liked about her is that she showed up to the door and she gave a meaty handshake. And Dad, there are a lot of voters who just respect just like showing up. You don't need to agree with somebody, just having the dignity to have a conversation and talk about, things in the community. And my dad liked that. And so I remember pulling a Democrat ballot and I voted for her, but I think there were some other races. And I remember coming home And he's like, who'd you vote for? I was like, this person, this person. He's like, you voted for the wrong person. I was like, well, how the heck was I supposed to know? Like, I'm 18. Like, I don't, I don't know any of this stuff, you know. But I will say that, I would say when I transferred from Purdue to Valpo, I was in the study intensive floor because I was trying to make up for lost time. And all of my friends were very politically astute. I was by far the most ignorant. They had chosen their political parties and they had kind of made their arguments. And, I had become a born again Christian at that point. And so I had kind of leaned in a conservative space based on a few things. And so during undergrad, I would say I was pretty politically agnostic or engaged. It wasn't really till the Great Recession happened that I started studying housing policy as a finance guy. And I realized these folks in DC really don't know what they're doing, or they don't, I'm an Nassim Taleb kind of guy. And
Yeah.
so as a finance person, I was an undergrad and I had this epiphany. It was so weird. I started kind of studying philosophy and I was struggling with my own faith. And when I started studying statistics, because I had two classes, I hated how mechanical it was. I thought you can't box philosophy into this granimals kind of exercise. I knew there was something about the unknown and the unseen. And then when I read Taleb's book, I said, this guy gets me 110%. We think the exact same thing about randomness in nature, mathematics and events and all that. And so that kind of carried me into the housing policy about politicians who don't understand risk fundamentally. And then when I went to grad school, what happened in 2009 was that I basically kind of, used the internet and I Googled the local political party and I said I wanted to get engaged. And I wouldn't call it a gang, but when you get involved, there's like little volunteer things that you do. You knock on some doors, you make some phone calls, you try to call some people to come to a fundraiser. And then once you kind of become part of the crew, from there, it's kind of like, it's getting the door. It's what you know to stay, generally speaking. But that's how I got involved at the local level. And, by my mid 20s, I was the party co-chair of a very wealthy, white, affluent community. And I ran the golf outing. I helped run what's called the annual Lincoln Day dinner, where you have a big keynote speaker from either Indianapolis or maybe a national figurehead. And so, you kind of fell into it, but it's really a game of relationships at the end of the day.
And then how about the move to DC? So what was that like?
Well, that was kind of an about face in many ways, where, the clothing store, thinking about our friends from the Menfluential Conference who, Antonio Centeno got out of, custom clothing. He got into Google SEO, digital marketing, ads, and things of that nature. Aaron Marino, successful through most of YouTube and his history. And so independent menswear stores, if you're not in a very touristy area, the business model doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Let me give you an example. I would go to the Javits Center in New York City at the end of January, right? It's cold, it's freezing. I would be making buying decisions based on some forecasts. And I used a company called Management One. They would say, hey, Robert, 10% goes to casual trousers, 5% for ties, 25% for blazers, and whatever that breakdown would be. And so they call you're open to buy. I'm showing up with $200,000 or whatever. This is how I need to make sure I don't get too heavy in any particular product category, right? So I show up and there's 300 vendors and you're making buying decisions in January for August to October delivery, right? Do you know what the winter is going to be like in Indiana 10 or 11 months from when you make that buying decision? Because I certainly don't. And so it didn't make sense to me to buy outerwear from a particular company. Let's call it Barber. Let's pick on them, right? Great company. I own a few of their wax jackets and whatever vests. So you go to Barber, you're like, okay, I need this many wax jackets in size small, medium, and large. They manufacture them over the summer and then they deliver. They take orders at about 4 trade shows. Chicago, it's New York, Chicago. It was Dallas and Vegas at the time. Things post-COVID are a little different. But essentially, you make those orders. They manufacture them over the summer. They deliver them in the fall. But the problem is Indiana doesn't even get really cold until January. So I'm getting these winter jackets, right, in September, October. Menswear retail makes all of its money from September to December. That's like 80% of your sales. You make some money in spring, like April, May, but once you get to June, July, that's when people are vacationing. So menswear, they're not buying stuff. January, February, deep, deep in the red. You're losing your butt no matter how good of a clothing store you are. And so think about this. You try to sell those winter jackets through November, December, but the reality is it's not getting cold until January. Well, people have a credit card hangover at the time. Well, you are trying to discount stuff at, 50, 60, 70% off. Well, if you're Macy's, you might break even on some of those goods, but for an independent menswear retailer, you're losing your tail. So you're trying to do what they call is turn the inventory. So you got to get that stuff out so I can get the spring wear in. So I just didn't really understand the whole model. I knew people who had stores that did $2 million of revenue, but their take home pay was like 100K. And it was, when you're working, I'm working. When you're taking a vacation for Christmas or Thanksgiving, as a retailer, I'm working twice as hard. So the whole like labor hour price per ratio didn't make any sense. And I'm an introvert. So as an introvert, I need like one day a week that I can kind of recharge my batteries, spend time alone or whatever. And when you're a retailer, you don't get that. And so that's when I was like, hey, I'm gonna shut this thing down. I'm gonna lose a lot of personal money, but Republicans are taking back Washington, D.C. from the House, the Senate, and the presidency. I'm gonna move out there and figure out how to make my money back. And so between kind of September of 16, when I knew I was kind of hitting the exit to the election, November, that's when I decided I was going to move to DC. And I really hit, I was 32 years old and really hit the reset button, and it's hard. DC is a hard city to break into, but you need to live here in order to get what they call the informational interviews to be able to try to land a job. That's probably the hardest part, getting your first job out here. But once you do and you're part of the system, then you can kind of, as I call, move about the cabin of the ship. And so, for the last 7.5 years, that's what I've been doing. But, it was a big pain point in the independent menswear, industry to finally transition to DC. And given my age and my experience, that's been a little bit of a benefactor where I just have a lot of people that I could, rely on to help me land, if that makes sense.
I've even thought about that. I'm like, if I had to transition, I don't even know how I would. I don't think I could. I mean, the idea of moving into a new space is kind of terrifying, and especially making a big leap like that. Once you get boots on ground, what did you do? Like, what was your modus operandi over there?
Yeah, well, I back in 2010, I received a fellowship from the Heritage Foundation to move to DC to work in the legal center, and I turned down the opportunity because I was doing other things in Indiana. Well, when I decided I was going to move to Washington, D.C., I reached out to that same group. It's called the Washington Scholars Fellowship, WSP. And they had it was called Zeta Psi, I believe. They had a unique relationship with Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, Ed Meese. And Ed Meese is the legal center at Heritage that's named after. It's the Ed Meese Legal Center. And so this admiral, Carey, was part of the same fraternity as Ed Meese. And so there was kind of this like backdoor way to become an intern/fellow in the legal center at Heritage. So I moved to DC having a guaranteed job, but I think at the end of the day, I think I made $9 an hour. So, 32 years old with a master's degree, $9 an hour in Washington, DC, you don't have a lot of gang. Yeah, you're making $1 an hour and you're reliving college days 10 years later. So I did that, and I tried to I spent that 4 months applying for jobs, and nothing came to fruition. I was unemployed all of May, and then I think the first half of June. And I did, because I used to sell life insurance, I would have between 6 to 10 informational interviews per day, because I learned how to pick up the phone and dial for dollars and email people and what they call prospect and get in front of folks. Now, the cool thing is that I had restarted my clothing brand under a name called Capitol Hill Clothiers, which I've since given away to a friend because he's more DC centric and I'm kind of more masculine and Midwest rustic. And so, I would show up to events in these kind of frilly window pane suits. And so people, when you do men's clothing in DC as a Politico, that's a unique skill. So people just tend to remember you. And so that helped me build my personal brand in the city of like, hey, there's the guy in the crazy suits or whatever. And so eventually I landed at kind of this think tank advocacy group over in Arlington in June of 17. And that's when I could finally cool my jets and, try to just figure out what the heck I wanted to do at that point. But I will tell you that this city is it's way more expensive now post COVID, where, a studio here is over $2,000. This is not a place where if you got student loan debt or if your parents aren't bankrolling you, you can really get ahead, very fast. You really need to have some back end support. And there's some groups that I'm involved with, like American Moment, that their entire goal is to provide fellowships to Capitol Hill offices at a tune, I believe it's like $3,000 a month, but they provide healthcare insurance and 401k and all that. But their goal is to basically fund people to get on Capitol Hill so that they can get a full-time job, so that they don't have to do the free internship or the $9 an hour,
Right.
internship or fellowship. Because this place has become a truly kind of a have and have nots place.
Yeah. And what does that mean for you now moving forward? Like, is this like you're in it now? This is your career path. Like, what are next steps for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, out here, you can't plan. The thing is, this is a city where people fail up. If I were to get fired tomorrow, there's probably maybe 5 jobs waiting for me in various things. There's no place in the country that kind of opportunity or demand for skill exists in that environment. My boss is running for governor in my home state. And so, that's a opportunity to move to the Capitol there. I'm known as kind of an alcohol expert out here. There may be opportunities in that space, but I think, the real focus for me in the next 6 months is doing a fundraiser and finishing this book. That's really important to me. It's been something I've been thinking about for 20 years, but only up until probably the year and a half, where I've spent every Saturday in the Library of Congress here a few blocks away for 8 hours every Saturday. I try to crank out 5,000 words, because it's hard to write when you're working in Congress because the days are too long, but you can't peg your future on one given thing. You need to have multiple fishing poles in the water and see what bites. But, I'll tell you that, most people are familiar that I'm an advocate for Northwest Indiana. I think we've got a unique history with steel and also kind of trailing off Chicago. And if COVID taught Chicago people anything, we're a much more cost-effective state. Lake Michigan properties are a lot cheaper. We've got the dunes, the National Lakeshore, which has some of the greatest biodiversity in the entire country for how small it is. And so there's a lot to be desired to go back to a little more slow cadence in the Midwest.
Yeah, I lived when I was in high school. I lived in Holland, Michigan. So yeah, I know the dunes and what I call the West Coast of Michigan. I loved it, man. I could totally see that. Like, I live in Colorado now, and it's like, yeah, prices are insane. And then it's like, man, I could technically work from anywhere. So
yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I had this colleague when I was working for my previous employer. We would do these state meetings around the country, and we had one in Grand Rapids, and they would basically fund they would basically pay for the airline there and back. So you could pick the days. But the cool thing is the conference would always be like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but you could stay with the prorated, like the group package for Saturday, Sunday on your own dime. So I always did that wherever I traveled. Well, me and this colleague, we stayed in Grand Rapids, but then drove around through to my friend's distillery in Three Oaks, which is close to the state line, New Buffalo. We stayed a night in Northwest Indiana, and then we flew out of O'Hare in Chicago. We made this full loop. But when he got to Valpo, we went to this old college bar, and he was from New Jersey. So he's used to, darn near New York prices. When he saw that, so this is 2018, so pre-COVID, he's like, wait, shots at Jack Daniels are $3?
Right.
I can buy a pitcher of beer for $4? It blew his mind to where he was like, I'm going to buy the whole bar, anything I want. It's because, for him, the prices are 3x plus in New Jersey. And then, he lives, we're friends in DC. But it just shows you kind of the differential between the coast and the Midwest. But I'll tell you, during COVID, with my best friend, we traveled all the way up to Saugatuck, and we were doing wine bars. But it was funny because the governor was so stringent that we were up there drinking red wine. But as soon as you put the red wine down, you had to put your mask back on. And we're like, we're not sure this makes a whole lot of sense, you know.
It
Uh,
doesn't, zero. And in hindsight,
for
we can
my, for
see it
my,
and be like, oh, yeah, that made no sense at all.
yeah, like, yeah, you're not saving anybody anything. But my two
No.
half sisters, or two of my half sisters, are actually from Commerce Township, Michigan,
Yep.
just outside Detroit. So I spent a fair amount of time in Michigan, and I think it's you know, other than the winters that can be pretty cold. I
Yes.
remember as a kid going up there doing some fishing. I think it's in after 2010. Here's a fun fact for you. In 2010, Michigan was like the only state in the union to lose population because of the Great Recession and the auto industry collapse, right?
Mm,
They did it was they loosened up their alcohol laws, and they were kind of one of the OG states for like craft breweries and stuff.
yep.
And so when I was an undergrad,
Yep.
one of my one of my colleagues in the finance program was from Kalamazoo, and he would go home, and he would drive down, he would bring Bell's,
Yep.
which Bell's wasn't in Illinois or in
Yep. No.
Indiana. And this is 2006, and it was neat because I actually went up to Kalamazoo at some point, and what a great brewery. But Michigan was kind of ahead of the curve, and it was like, hey, like, we're in trouble economically. What can we do to inspire entrepreneurship? And post prohibition, loosen up your alcohol laws, not a bad idea.
Yeah, no, they have some of the best breweries around. I think that's still the case. But like,
Totally.
I was very, very spoiled when I was like in the craft brew scene. Michigan was like top three, I'd say, in
Oh
the
yeah.
country, like easily. Yeah, it's just it's a gem, really, a gem of a state. I agree. And the winters are a little rough. And like in Holland, you get like they call it lake effect. So it's like very gray. It's allegedly like one of the grayest kind of parts of the country, like outside of Washington state. So that's a little kind of depressing. But if you can get through that, the summers are amazing. And I love Lake Michigan. I love the lakes. There's one place.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Anyway, so I know we're actually over time, Robert. Where can people reach out to find you, connect with you? Where can they go to pick up the book when it is released? Where else should we point people?
Yeah. So one of my goals in the past year, I had my website redone. It's www.robertordway.com. I've aggregated the Twitter handle, Instagram handle, pretty much everything is at Robert Ordway. Tried to homogenize all those things. On the website, there is a sign up for folks who are interested in the book. This August, I will be doing a 800 plus mile bike ride from DC to the Indiana Dunes, and there'll be a sign up for that. It's going to be a great opportunity to talk about the book. And, I plan to do some vlogging, I guess, every day, after riding 100 miles, if I have energy, to tell people what I'm thinking and, share my dad's story about his battle with ALS. But, I think
Awesome.
I'm very confident that the rest of this year, we're going to do some great things in the space. And hopefully people are looking to connect and, looking to, especially the manosphere or masculinity,
Yeah.
helping as someone who had a lot of challenges growing up, my goal is to take my dad's principles, Doug Ordway, and if I can transpose that to other men who have dads or not good dads or no dads, I think that's the real key. Because when you look at suicides and mental health issues and stuff, I think there's a derivative there when it comes to single parent households, and we need to do better going forward. That's for sure.
Yeah, I'd say one of the greatest challenges in the world today is the lack of great men. So I appreciate that endeavor. I'll be taking a look at that. I'll support your ALS trip, man, for sure. I'll be reading and following along, and I look forward to reading the book too. So Robert, thank you so much for being on In the Trenches, man. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me on the show. Appreciate it.